Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. So these two guys on a Sunday afternoon decide to meet at a park and go for a walk with their dogs. And they have a great hike. And at the end, one of them says, why don't we get a cup of coffee in that cafe across the street? His friend says, well, we've got dogs. They don't allow dogs there. His friend says, look, just do what I do. And he has a Doberman Pinscher, and this other guy has a Chihuahua. So this fellow puts on these sunglasses and he walks across the street and he goes to the maitre d' and he says, I'd like a table. And the maitre d' says, I'm sorry, we do not allow dogs. And he said, well, this is a seeing eye dog. And the maitre d' rolls his eyes and says, I just didn't know that Doberman Pinschers were seeing eye dogs. And the fellow says, well, it's an experiment. So the maitre d' rolls his eyes and says, over there. So he settles down, and his friend is across the street watching this, beginning to have an anxiety attack. He can feel all the symptoms arising, nauseous and everything else. But he puts on his sunglasses and he walks up to the maitre d' and says, I'd like a table. And the maitre d' says, I'm sorry, sir, we do not allow dogs. He says, this is a seeing eye dog. And the maitre d' says, sir, a Chihuahua? And the guy says, what? You mean they gave me a Chihuahua? So there are two things about that. First is, if you stay with your anxiety, you may come up with something clever to say. And the second thing is, I'll do pretty much anything to work a joke into a Dharma talk. I would like to talk a little bit about some strategies for transforming your relationship to anxiety. There's so much of it in the air. It's hard to not feel how anxious we are as a culture right now. So I'd like to talk about first how anxiety is a naturally occurring state. That there's a source for your anxiety if you look closely. And I've got a list of some tips that might be helpful when you find yourself feeling anxious. And a little bit on long-term strategies for working with anxiety. So first, anxiety is a natural function of the brain. Without anxiety, you'd end up as sort of natural proof of the law of the jungle, which says, if you rest and close your eyes, you'll be someone's lunch. It's that natural alertness we have that keeps us alive. It reminded me of a relatively dramatic experience I had quite a few years ago. I was in the Peace Corps in Niger, in French West Africa, and I was teaching in the University of Niamey, in the capital city. And the university was on the other side of the river, of the Niger River, which is one of the largest rivers in Africa. And it was the John F. Kennedy Bridge, and it was 2 lanes, and the bridge was always just an amazing spectacle. There'd be these huge trucks, convoys of bringing stuff back and forth. Quite often there were camel trains, 80 to 100 camels bringing firewood into the city. Then there'd be donkeys pulling carts, and buses, and cars, and motorcycles, and hand carts, and push carts, and bicycles, and people walking, all on these 2 lanes. So heading across the river was always an adventure. And I had a little souped-up moped, and one of the fun things was to get down low, because the camels would have their, the wood tied, balanced on either side of them, so you get down really low and go underneath the wood loads. But you have to look out for the stray stick that would be hanging low. But I had left my office, and one of my colleagues was driving away, and I'd wanted to talk to him before he headed home. And I thought, I missed Tom. And suddenly I had this gut clench inside. And this little voice said, "You'll see him on the bridge. Something terrible has happened." And I just kind of put it away. But then I got on my little moped, and traffic was backed up, and I did my get down low and go into the camels thing, and just where the bridge would rise over the river, everything had stopped, and there was this very long, thin trickle of blood, and there was maybe a 15 or 16-year-old young man who was obviously dead. And that it was such a corroboration of that clench. But then the story got even stranger. It was absolute chaos. Everyone was yelling. The police were yelling at the drivers. The truck driver was yelling at other truck drivers. And there was this boy just lying there. And I just had this thought where I just thought, no one is praying for this. No one's praying for this kid. Like, no one's paying attention to the kid. They're all screaming at each other. And I just closed my eyes, and I could actually feel or hallucinate or imagine, who knows, this sense of like this spirit just bouncing around. And I just said, in my own way, I just said, you can't go back to that body. It's okay, but you have to go. And then suddenly I just felt this presence right by me. And then it just kind of disappeared. It was quite a memorable experience. But what really struck me initially was just that sense of that clutch, that foreboding that I felt in my body. And that feeling? Just that sense of like, something's wrong. And the interesting thing is how that sense of something wrong is not necessarily a bad thing. It's some higher function of your mind that it's serving you. It's wanting you to be safe. It's wanting to help you discern the right path. The flip side of free-form anxiety is wise discernment. You're really sensing everything out there and trying to find your own path. And yet, anxiety is there all the time, no matter where we go. I always love Jerry Seinfeld describes his experience of scuba diving. And later, afterward, he said, I decided I don't want to do a sport where I'm thinking always, don't die, don't die, don't die, don't die. So anxiety is a natural function. The challenge, of course, is when you can't turn it off, or when the anxiety becomes kind of doubling on itself. And it can definitely spin out of control. So in terms of wise discernment, what the practice of meditation is all about is about seeing clearly, about seeing what's real. The classic teaching story is of a woman in her village walking down the street who sees a big snake in the road. And she runs back to her hut and spends the entire night sort of shaking in fear of how close she came to stepping on this rope. And very, very timidly, she goes out in the morning and starts to walk down the street, and she sees that that snake is actually a piece of rope that someone left in the road. And of course, the question becomes, how many of the snakes in your life are actually ropes? And that's what the practice of clear seeing, of vipassana, can give you. To really see what's true. To move through your delusions, your stories, your preferences, all of that, to actually come in contact with what's real. As I thought about that story of sort of seeing a rope and thinking it's a snake, it reminded me of another time back in when I was in Niger. There's a state park or a national park in Niger, and some good friends who were rangers there. So I would go down, and you weren't allowed in the park unless you're in a car. But they had motorcycles, and we would sometimes just walk in the park. So there were lions and giraffes, and it was really quite extraordinary. I had this great 500 millimeter lens. So we were just watching some lions, and I remember I had this lion perfectly framed in my lens, and then it charged. And of course, 500 millimeter lens, it was like it was 2 feet away from me. And I quickly realized, it's over there. So I turned to my friend, one of the rangers, to say, wow, that was pretty cool. I looked over my shoulder, and he was running as fast as he could in the other direction. So we would sleep outside because it was so hot, and you could hear the lions, roaring around in the park. And I remember at one point I was dreaming about this lion that was going to eat me, and I was just caught in that. You can't move, you can barely breathe, and I could feel it right there. And then I kind of woke up and I opened my eyes, and one of the little kitty cats was sitting on my chest, just looking at me like that. It was Mark Twain who famously said, "The worst things in my life never actually happened." We tend to live in this kind of hallucinatory haze of what could go wrong. And it's very helpful to recognize that your awareness gets clouded by three main factors. It gets clouded by greed, of wanting, of craving, of fantasy, wanting something more, wanting something different. It pulls you out of what's actually happening. And it gets clouded by hatred, by aversion, by anger, by judgment, by blame. And again, it moves you away from what's actually happening. And the third is delusion or confusion. And delusion can be said to be that you're believing something is true that isn't, or you are not believing something true and it is. So fundamentally, when you begin to practice non-judging awareness, whether that be in a formal meditation or just embracing, what does it mean to look through a lens of non-judging awareness? Inevitably, you begin to see more clearly as to what is true. You begin to see into the nature of impermanence, how everything changes. You get to see how you're relating to what's changing. And you begin to see into the nature of who you truly are. And of course, when you see how everything is changing, you recognize that this body, everyone you know, at some point will fall away in no particular order. That is reality. That everyone you know in no particular order is going to die. The comic Louis C.K. has this great little shtick he does where he talks about the fact that, the mortality rate and how many people are going to die, and in this large, audience, he said, look, the reality is statistically, a few of you aren't going to make it home tonight. Our numbers are lower, so we don't have to worry about that. So when we look at anxiety, we can sense that what's under anxiety is fear. And of course, fear takes many different forms. There's the fear of loss, the fear of losing control, the fear of shame, the fear of losing attention, affection, and love. I'm not sure it's so much about letting go of anxiety as it is about being with anxiety. So a little bit on how do we be with anxiety when it arises. I was once on a long meditation retreat, and I was really anxious about what I was going to do when I got back, the decisions I had to make, and this was quite a ways out. And I suddenly had this idea, and I recommend this to everyone on a meditation retreat, particularly toward the end, because inevitably you start leaning forward. What I did for myself is I chose a time when it was totally okay to start obsessing about going home. And that kind of worked for me. It actually opened up a space for me to have an experience. And that can be an interesting way to work with your anxiety, is to choose a time when it's totally okay to be anxious. It's a completely artificial little mental thing, but it can be helpful. Of course, we can't talk about anxiety without talking about the acronym of RAIN, which I know many of us are familiar with. The R, to recognize when the mind is in an anxious state. And again, just naming it can be so helpful. Sometimes just naming it frees it up a little bit. Oh, I'm anxious. The A, to allow or to accept it, to make room for it. The I, to be intimate with it, to investigate it. And here, of course, we talk about how the mind does not exist without the body does not exist without the mind. So when the mind is anxious, if you look to the body, you'll find where that anxiety lives on the inside. And oftentimes we know what that is. And today I was teaching at the Rayburn House office building. Congressman Tim Ryan started a meditation group for congressmen and staff, so I was leading today, hence the tie. And I wasn't sure where I was going to park. I wasn't sure what the traffic was going to be like, and I was very aware as I was driving in. I could feel the tension in my stomach. I could feel the tightness and the mental agitation. It was mentally anxious, but it was relatively easy to find where I felt that. And of course, when I looked a little bit closer, Well, what was that anxiety all about? Well, there was some fear. There was a fear I was going to be late. There was a fear I was going to look stupid by running in sweaty with the class already having started. And the whole hallucination I was beginning to womp up in my brain. So just by naming it, I could see it. Okay, I'm anxious. I used to always have something that I called a 10-minute rule. That whenever I had to be anywhere, I would be there 10 minutes early. And when I moved to D.C., it's the 30-minute rule. And I just plan on being 30 minutes early. I bring something to do, and it has really shifted my anxiety about getting around. But my 30-minute rule is beginning to tighten up on me a little bit. But naming it helped, kind of making room for it as I'm driving down Constitution, like, okay, I can be with this. I know this feeling. And then really being intimate with it. Okay, so here it is. How can I be with this? And I could see the nature, what was under the anxiety was fear. Now the end part of that equation is to nourish. Nourish it with some empathy, with some compassion, with some kindness, and then track what that's like. And so I was able to do that. And something shifted for me. I was able to find my way, and everything worked out just fine. So a few little tips when you find yourself anxious. Anxiety is tied to worry, and worry is tied to restlessness. So when you are caught in anxiety, the mind is just jumping around all over the place. Or have you noticed how it's like you're on a hamster wheel and it's just sort of spinning the same thing without any resolution? So the antidote to that is one-pointedness or concentration. So just focusing on one thing can be very, very helpful. There's a very cool experience that you can do when you find yourself anxious. And it's looking for three things. And we can just do this right now, just to kind of give you a little taste of it. So just visually find three different things that you can notice visually right now. You just look around, notice one thing, notice another, and notice another. And then if you like, you can close your eyes. And notice if you can identify three different sounds. And now shift your attention to feeling or touch. And can you identify three separate forms of touch or feeling? And then if you like, you can open your eyes. So did you feel a little shift in that experiment? Really what you're doing is you're shifting from the anxious mind, and you're giving the mind a job to do. And when you give the mind the job to do in the senses, you're calling your attention back to the here and now. So that can be a helpful little exercise anytime, but particularly when the mind is really restless. Because three separate things you see, three separate things you hear, and then three separate things you feel. Again, it's a way to invoke some concentration. And of course, the byproduct of concentration is calming. You'll get a little more calm. Another thing you might explore is noticing that when you're caught in anxiety or worry, have you noticed sometimes that, like a low-grade fever, there's low-grade anxiety? There's just kind of free-floating anxiety. It can be very, very helpful to name what you're anxious about. A process that I find very helpful, that we use a lot in the Year of Living Mindfully and for Body-Centered Inquiry, is just to ask, what's between me and feeling free right now? Just name it, kind of move it to the side, and then ask again, what's between me and feeling free right now? You say hello to it, move it to the side, and just continue for a while. And oftentimes what happens is you'll have this sense of like, oh, other than these 12 things, I'm starting to feel pretty free. But you've named them. And that can be so helpful. And what I remember, which is not that often, but if I wake up, and you know that feeling, you wake up, you feel fine, and then the software programs start booting up. And before you know it, you're already tight and clenched into the day. But even before you get out of bed, you can just ask, okay, so what's between me and feeling free right now? And what I find is if I just name, oh yeah, there's this email I have to write, there's this conversation I have to have, I haven't worked out in a couple days, I got to do that. But just by naming it, there'll be a little bit more space, just a little more freedom. So pausing, particularly when anxiety is free form, and just naming all those things that are between you and feeling free or happy, I have found to be a very helpful exercise. Another helpful thing, once you've identified something about which you're feeling some anxiety, is to ask yourself, is this a solvable problem? And I have found for myself a very helpful distinction there when I recognize that here's the anxiety. Do I have any control over this? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Maybe there are a few things I can do, but just having that distinction of asking yourself, is there anything I can do about this? Is this a solvable problem? That's helped me quite a bit. And that leads to the next one, which is around just making room for uncertainty. There's a wonderful phrase that says, relax. Absolutely nothing is under control. Making room for that can be quite helpful. There are other ways you can explore on a kind of a mental way. The questions that help you to reframe an issue that comes up. Just to ask yourself, what's great about this? Or what could be great about this? It can be a very helpful way of just sort of shifting your attitude toward it, or forcing you to think about it in a different way. I'm covering a lot of ground here because each one of these we could really take apart and dive into. But another helpful one, particularly if there's something you're clear about, anxiety or worry, is to pause and ask yourself, what story am I believing right now? What's the story I'm believing? And this one takes some rigor to really get to what you're believing about this issue. But this one has a lot of juice. We talked about this strategy before, but just briefly, that when you can really identify what you're believing about this, and then ask yourself if that belief is true. then you have to ask yourself, is that really true? And then to take some time to ask yourself, when I think this thought, when I believe this story, what's it like inside? So you can really sense what it's like when that thought is operative. And when you have a really good sense of that, there's one more question you can ask that's kind of getting out the machete or the samurai sword, and to ask, who am I without this thought? And pay attention to that. That wonderful work of Byron Katie, if you're not familiar with her, can be very, very helpful. Because again, anywhere there's anxiety, there's fear. Anywhere there's fear, there's something you're believing. And when you could really examine that belief and ask yourself who you are without that belief, it may just be a glimpse, or it may open up some fresh possibilities you hadn't thought of before or hadn't experienced before. Another element I've noticed in my own experience with anxiety, and that is to notice who you're hanging out with or what kind of input you're taking in. I've noticed the more I listen to headlines on the radio, the more anxious I get. Or certain people who have a certain perspective, the more I let that influence me, the more anxiety I might have. It's helpful to notice that when you feel anxiety, to ask yourself, well, what preceded this anxiety? It's something we oftentimes explore on meditation retreats, that when you experience a strong mental state, just to ask, what happened before this? What triggered this? And again, it's all part of really slowing down and having tea with your anxiety when it arises. So these are just a few suggestions, a few ways of working with anxiety when it arises. To use concentration or one-pointed awareness to help you get grounded and call your attention back. To choose a time when it's okay to worry. It's a little artificial, but that can be helpful. To ask yourself if it's a solvable problem. To reframe the issue, to ask, well, what's great about this? What can I learn about this? To explore the belief that might be there. But the bottom line of our practice is about finding out what's true. Or the radical statement I love is practicing wholehearted, enthusiastic cooperation with reality. That's what the practice is all about. So there's a broader element to anxiety I wanted to touch on. We have so many voices that speak at different times. We have the voice of fear, we have the controlling voice, we have the spiritual adventure voice, we have the voice of the child, etc., etc. But a few words from Michael Singer, who wrote the book, The Untethered Soul. He says this: in case you haven't noticed, you have a mental dialogue going on inside your head that never stops. It just keeps going and going. Have you ever wondered why it talks in there? How does it decide what to say and when to say it? And how much of what it says turns out to be true? How much of what it says is even important? And if right now you're hearing, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't have any voice inside my head, that's the voice we're talking about. If you're smart, you'll take the time to step back, examine this voice, and get to know it better. The problem is you're too close to be objective. If you spend some time observing this mental voice, the first thing you will notice is that it never shuts up. When left to its own, it just talks. And this is the power of stepping back, as Michael said there. In Zen, it's called the backward step. That when you find that voice of worry and anxiety racing through, and when you can also feel it embodied, to step back. He goes on to say, the best way to free yourself from this incessant chatter is to step back and view it objectively. Just view the voice as a vocalizing mechanism that is capable of making it appear like someone is in there talking to you. Don't think about it, just notice it. No matter what the voice is saying, it's all the same. It doesn't matter if it's saying nice things or mean things, worldly things or spiritual things. It doesn't matter because it's just a voice talking inside your head. Stop feeling that one thing it says to you and the other thing it says to you is not you. If you're hearing it talk, it's obviously not you. You are the one who hears the voice. You are the one who notices it talking. So when the voice of anxiety is cycling through, it's critical to notice the voice. And it's even more critical to recognize that that voice is not you. Awareness is not anxious. You're aware of anxiety. And when you can take that stance, there's a world of difference. And so anxiety is there to serve you. It's part of wise discernment. It's the function that is scanning to show you the best and wisest path. When that voice gets too powerful and overwhelming and we find ourselves caught, it's helpful to remember that the root of that is fear. And by pausing, making room for it, exploring how to be with it, nourishing it with empathy, you can shift that voice of anxiety back to that voice of wise discernment. It's not easy, but it's possible. Why don't we close with a short meditation? You might feel the breath. And in your own way, just make contact with the aliveness of the senses here and now. Breath, sound, feeling. And reflecting on your own relationship with anxiety and worry and that restlessness of mind. And in your own way, just saying hello to this, letting it know you see it. And you might sense in your own way this function of anxiety as this quality of wise discernment, scanning your world, providing input for you to make wise choices. And when you find that voice of anxiety strong or overwhelming, just sensing what it might be like to pause and to let it know you see it. And in your own way to offer it some kindness or empathy or compassion. If you hear anxiety talk, it is obviously not you. You are the one who hears the voice. You are the one who notices that it's talking. And we'll close with this short poem by Mary Oliver. I worried a lot. Will the garden grow? Will the rivers flow in the right direction? Will the earth turn as it was taught? If not, how shall I correct it? Was I right? Was I wrong? Will I be forgiven? Can I do better? Will I ever be able to sing? Even the sparrows can do it, and I am, hopeless. Is my eyesight fading, or am I just imagining it? Am I going to get rheumatism, lockjaw, dementia? Finally, I saw that worrying had come to nothing and gave it up and took my old body and went out into the morning and sang. You might just take a moment and sense if there's someone in your life who may be caught in anxiety or worry right now. And in your own way, just to send them your blessings, to wish them well. To wish them safety and peace. And offering this to yourself as well. And gently deepening the breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open.